The rain had stopped only minutes before sunset, leaving the streets of Nashville glowing beneath the amber lights that flickered to life one by one. It was the spring of 1965, a time when Music City breathed through its bars, recording studios, and smoky dance halls. Every street seemed to carry the sound of a guitar. Every doorway held the promise that someone unknown might become tomorrow's legend. On that particular evening, few people noticed the black Cadillac easing quietly down Broadway. Inside sat the biggest entertainer in America, Elvis Presley. He had spent the entire afternoon inside RCA Studio B recording songs. The session had been exhausting. Producers wanted perfection. Managers wanted schedules. Reporters wanted interviews. Fans wanted smiles. Everyone wanted something from Elvis. For hours, he had smiled exactly when he was expected to smile. He had laughed exactly when cameras demanded it. By the time recording ended, all he wanted was silence. "Where to, Mr. Presley?" his driver asked. Elvis looked out the rain-speckled window. Instead of answering immediately, he noticed something. Halfway down the block stood an old wooden building with a faded neon sign. The Broken String Tavern. The place wasn't famous. Tourists rarely found it. It wasn't where celebrities were seen. It was where musicians hid. Elvis smiled faintly. "Pull over." The driver looked surprised. "Here?" "Yeah." "You sure?" "I don't want anybody following me tonight." The driver nodded. Within moments, Elvis stepped onto the wet sidewalk, wearing a plain black leather jacket over a dark shirt. No flashy jewelry except the familiar rings he always wore. No security detail. No photographers. Just another man looking for somewhere to breathe. Or so he hoped. Inside, the tavern smelled of old oak, tobacco, fresh coffee, and decades of forgotten songs. The room wasn't large, perhaps 50 people, truck drivers, factory workers, couples dancing slowly near the jukebox, 3 musicians tuning guitars near the corner stage. Nobody looked twice when Elvis entered. Without the stage lights, without the jumpsuit, without screaming crowds, he almost disappeared. That anonymity felt strangely comforting. He ordered black coffee. The bartender slid the mug toward him. "Long day?" Elvis chuckled. "A little. You look familiar." "I get that sometimes." The bartender shrugged. "Guess everybody's got a twin." Elvis laughed for real this time. He found a booth in the back where shadows hid most of his face. For the first time in weeks, nobody expected anything from him. Across the room, another man entered quietly carrying a worn leather notebook. His curly hair was messy beneath a simple cap. He wore a denim jacket. No one recognized him either, at least not immediately. Bob Dylan, 23 years old, already becoming one of folk music's brightest voices. He had come to Nashville searching for new sounds, new stories, and people whose music couldn't be manufactured inside expensive recording studios. He preferred places exactly like this. He ordered tea, not whiskey, never before writing. He noticed the man sitting alone in the back. Something about him seemed oddly familiar, but Bob couldn't place the face beneath the dim light. Instead, he opened his notebook. He always listened before speaking. The owner of the tavern climbed onto the tiny stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conversations faded. "We've got ourselves open music tonight." Scattered applause. "If you've got a song," he pointed toward the microphone, "the stage is yours." One after another, local musicians performed. A young woman sang an old Appalachian ballad. A teenage guitarist nervously played blues. A husband and wife harmonized beautifully, despite forgetting half the lyrics. Nobody laughed. Everyone encouraged everyone else. This wasn't television. This wasn't competition. It was community. Elvis watched quietly. His fingers tapped gently against the coffee mug. He missed nights like this. Before the screaming, before Hollywood, before every performance became business, back when songs belonged to people. Nearly an hour passed. Then the tavern door creaked open again. The room barely noticed. An elderly man slowly stepped inside, perhaps 65, maybe older. Life had a way of adding years faster than calendars. His gray jacket had been repaired countless times. His boots were cracked. One sleeve had been stitched together with mismatched thread. Over one shoulder rested an old acoustic guitar case. The leather straps looked older than many people inside the room. He walked carefully, not because he was weak, because every movement suggested someone protecting the last valuable thing he owned. His guitar. He approached the stage. The owner smiled warmly. "Evening, Walter. So long as you'll have me. You always got a place here." Walter nodded gratefully. Several regular customers applauded. Not loudly, respectfully. The bartender leaned toward Elvis. "He's been coming here almost every Thursday for years." "Professional?" "Used to be." "What happened?" The bartender sighed. "Depends on who tells the story." Elvis looked back toward the stage. "What story do you believe?" "I believe life happened." Walter placed the guitar on his lap. His hands shook slightly while tuning. Arthritis? Age? Maybe both. Someone from the audience called out kindly, "Take your time, Walter." He smiled. "I intend to." The room laughed softly. Then silence settled. Walter leaned toward the microphone. "I'd like to play a song that's gotten me through some difficult years." He paused. "Folsom Prison Blues." A few people nodded instantly. Johnny Cash's song had already become one of the most recognizable country tunes in America. Walter began picking the familiar rhythm, slowly, carefully. His voice wasn't strong anymore, but it carried honesty. Every lyric sounded lived rather than performed. Elvis closed his eyes. There was something beautiful about imperfection. Halfway through the first verse, the tavern door slammed open. 3 younger men staggered inside, cowboy hats, beer bottles, loud voices, already drunk. The tallest one looked no older than 30. He spotted Walter, smirked. "Oh, no." The bartender whispered under his breath. "You boys behave," the owner warned. The tall cowboy ignored him. Instead, he folded his arms and watched Walter struggle through a chord change. The older man's fingers slipped. Only slightly, but enough. The cowboy laughed loudly. "Thought so." Nobody else laughed. Walter kept playing, trying not to hear him, trying to focus. The cowboy wasn't finished. "You know," he stepped closer to the stage, "if you're gonna sing Johnny Cash," he grinned cruelly, "at least sing it right." A few uncomfortable glances spread across the room. Walter pretended not to notice. His hands shook a little more. He missed another chord. The cowboy laughed even harder. "There it is." One of his friends joined him. "I've heard jukeboxes with better timing." More laughter. But only from their table. Everyone else remained silent. Bob Dylan slowly closed his notebook. His eyes never left Walter. He had seen this before. Talented people destroyed not by failure, but by humiliation. He hated it. Yet he stayed seated, watching, listening, waiting. Walter tried beginning the second verse. His voice cracked. The cowboy interrupted again. "Hey, old man." Walter stopped. The room froze. The cowboy pointed directly at him. "If you know Folsom Prison Blues so well," he laughed, "then play it." His friends burst into laughter. The sentence echoed through the tavern. "If you know it so well, play it." Walter stared at his guitar. Not at the crowd, not at the cowboy, just the guitar. For several seconds he said nothing. The silence hurt far more than the insults. Then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, Walter spoke. "I used to." The words carried decades of heartbreak, not anger, not resentment, just truth. "I used to play it better." No one moved. No one breathed. The cowboy rolled his eyes. "Guess those days are over." Walter slowly began placing the guitar back into its case. His shoulders seemed smaller now. The room watched a proud musician folding himself into silence. From the back corner, a chair scraped across the wooden floor. Every head turned. The man in the black leather jacket stood up. He calmly picked up his untouched coffee, walked toward the stage, set the cup down beside Walter, and spoke only 5 quiet words. "Don't close that guitar case." Walter looked up in confusion. The stranger smiled gently, then reached for the spare microphone. Across the room, Bob Dylan's eyes widened. He finally recognized the man stepping into the light. Elvis Presley. And somehow, everyone instinctively knew that the night was about to become something none of them would ever forget. The room seemed to stop breathing. Even the buzzing neon beer sign behind the bar felt strangely quiet. Walter still held his guitar case in one hand, his weathered fingers trembling just enough for everyone to notice. The cruel laughter from the 3 drunken cowboys had finally faded, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The stranger in the black leather jacket stood only a few feet away. "Don't close that guitar case." Walter searched the younger man's face. There was something familiar about him. The jawline, the eyes, the unmistakable confidence that wasn't arrogance but calm certainty. "I don't think," Walter began softly, "I don't think anyone came here to hear an old man embarrass himself." The stranger smiled. "No." He gently rested a hand on the guitar case. "They came here for music." Walter sighed. "I've forgotten how." "No," the stranger replied. "You've only forgotten how to believe they still want to hear it." Across the room, Bob Dylan leaned forward so suddenly that his notebook slipped from the table. His heart was racing. There was no mistaking him now. It was Elvis Presley. Not surrounded by bodyguards, not beneath stage lights, not wearing one of the tailored suits fans expected. Just Elvis, standing beside a forgotten musician. Bob quietly whispered to himself, "What's he doing here?" He wasn't the only one wondering. One customer slowly stood. Another narrowed his eyes. The bartender looked twice. Recognition spread through the tavern like a slow-moving wave. One woman gasped. Another covered her mouth. "My lord! That's... No! It can't be!" Within seconds, every pair of eyes was fixed on the man beside Walter. Still, Elvis didn't acknowledge anyone. His attention never left the older musician. The drunken cowboy laughed again. "Oh, look at this!" He pointed toward Elvis. "Another guitar hero." His friends chuckled. "You gonna save him?" Elvis finally turned. His expression never changed. He wasn't angry. That somehow made him even more intimidating. "I wasn't planning to save anybody." The cowboy smirked. "Then why'd you get up?" Elvis answered without raising his voice. "Because I've watched enough good musicians put away their guitars because someone decided cruelty was entertainment." The cowboy shrugged. "If he can't handle a joke," Elvis interrupted. "A joke makes everyone laugh." He looked directly into the man's eyes. Only one table laughed. The room fell silent again. The cowboy opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Walter looked down. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," his voice cracked. "But they're right. My hands don't work like they used to. I miss chords. I forget lyrics. I lose the rhythm." Elvis nodded. "So do I." Walter blinked. "You? I've forgotten lyrics in front of 15,000 people." Several people in the audience exchanged surprised looks. Elvis continued. "I've missed notes. I've started songs in the wrong key. I've walked off stage wondering whether I belonged there anymore." Walter looked unconvinced. "That's different." "No," Elvis shook his head. "The only difference is—" He looked around the room. "When I make mistakes, people write about them." Walter couldn't help smiling. Just a little. Bob Dylan watched every word. This wasn't the Elvis newspapers described. This wasn't Hollywood's Elvis. This was a man speaking musician to musician. No cameras, no publicity, no applause, just honesty. Bob quietly opened his notebook again. This conversation deserved to be remembered. The bartender finally broke the silence. "Mr.—" He stopped himself. "Elvis." Every head turned again. "So it really is you." Elvis gave an embarrassed smile. "I was hoping nobody would notice." The bartender laughed. That plan didn't last long. A few customers chuckled. The tension eased slightly. Walter slowly removed the guitar from its case once more. Its finish had faded after decades of use. Tiny scratches covered almost every inch of the wood. Elvis admired it. "How long have you had her?" Walter looked at the instrument with affection. "Since 1943. Elvis gently whistled. "She's older than some careers." Walter smiled. "Longer than mine." He carefully tuned one string, then another. The room remained perfectly quiet. No one wanted to interrupt. The drunken cowboy folded his arms. "So what's the plan?" He looked directly at Elvis. "You gonna play Johnny Cash better than Johnny Cash?" His friends laughed again. Elvis smiled politely. "No." The cowboy frowned. "No? I'm not here to compete with Johnny." "Then what?" "I'm here to remind everyone what songs are for." The cowboy rolled his eyes. "Songs are for people who can actually play." Walter slowly lowered his head again. Elvis noticed immediately. He stepped closer to the microphone. "I disagree." The cowboy shrugged dramatically. "Go ahead." Elvis rested both hands on the old guitar. "I think songs belong to whoever needs them most." Something changed inside the room. The atmosphere softened. Even customers who had never met Walter before suddenly felt protective of him. The elderly musician stood quietly, staring at his own guitar as though wondering whether it still belonged in his hands. Elvis leaned closer. "Tell me something." Walter nodded. "When was the last time someone asked why you started playing?" Walter looked surprised. "No one's ever asked." "I'm asking." The old man's eyes drifted toward the ceiling. His voice became distant. "My older brother." The room grew even quieter. He bought this guitar after coming home from the war. He couldn't really afford it. He said every family ought to have music inside the house. Walter smiled sadly. He taught me 3 chords. What happened to him? Elvis asked gently. Walter swallowed. Korea. No one spoke. He never came home. Walter looked down at the guitar. So every time I played, his fingers brushed the worn wood. It felt like he was still sitting beside me. Several people quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Bob Dylan stopped writing. Some stories deserved simply to be heard. Elvis reached for the microphone. He looked around the room before speaking. I'd like to ask everyone something. Nobody answered. If this guitar, he gently touched its body, is carrying the memory of a man who never made it home, he paused, then who exactly were you laughing at? His words landed like stones in still water. The cowboy's smile disappeared. His 2 friends looked away. No one in the tavern could meet Walter's eyes anymore. Not because they were ashamed of him, because they were ashamed they hadn't defended him sooner. The cowboy shifted awkwardly. For the first time that night, he had nothing clever to say. Walter quietly cleared his throat. I appreciate your kindness. He looked toward Elvis. But you still haven't answered their question. What question? Walter smiled. Can you actually play Folsom Prison Blues? The room erupted into gentle laughter. Even Elvis laughed. I know enough. Walter raised an eyebrow. Enough? Elvis grinned. I know enough to stay out of Johnny Cash's way. More laughter filled the tavern. The tension finally broke. Even the bartender shook his head, smiling. Elvis stepped beside Walter instead of in front of him. I'm not taking your stage. He adjusted the second microphone. I'm borrowing a corner of it. Walter chuckled. Fair enough. He positioned his fingers on the opening chord once more. This time, they were steadier. Not because his arthritis had disappeared, but because fear had begun to. Across the room, Bob Dylan slowly closed his notebook. Something told him that what was about to happen would never be repeated. Not in another bar, not in another city, not even on another stage. Sometimes, history wasn't made inside stadiums. Sometimes it happened in forgotten taverns where no reporters were waiting. The bartender dimmed the lights over the audience. Only the small wooden stage remained illuminated. Walter took one deep breath. Elvis nodded. The room became completely silent. Then, just as Walter's fingers were about to strike the first chord, the tavern door opened once again. A man in a long, dark coat stepped inside, carrying nothing but a guitar case with J.R. Cash stitched into the worn leather. Every head turned. Walter froze. Elvis stared toward the entrance. Bob Dylan slowly stood from his chair. No one had expected another visitor, and no one yet realized that the night was about to become even more unforgettable. The tavern door swung open so slowly that the old hinges seemed to groan louder than the conversations inside. Every pair of eyes turned toward the entrance. A tall man in a long, dark coat stepped inside, carrying an old guitar case with faded initials burned into the leather. J.R.C. For one impossible second, several people thought Johnny Cash himself had walked into the Broken String Tavern. Even Walter forgot to breathe. The man removed his hat. He wasn't Johnny Cash. He was older. His face carried deep lines carved by decades on the road. The bartender smiled with surprise. "Frank?" The newcomer nodded. "Evening." Walter's eyes widened. "I haven't seen you in almost 20 years, Frank finished quietly. The two old musicians stared at each other without speaking. Their silence carried more memories than words ever could. Elvis looked toward Walter. "You know him?" Walter smiled for the first time that night. "We used to play together." Frank laughed. "Used to argue together." The room chuckled. Walter nodded. "That too." Frank placed his guitar case gently against the wall before walking onto the tiny stage. He looked at Walter. "I heard somebody outside saying you were getting picked apart in here." Walter shrugged. "Nothing I haven't survived before." Frank looked toward the three cowboys. "You boys the critics?" The tallest cowboy folded his arms. "We're the audience." Frank smiled. "Funny. I've played for audiences all over Tennessee." He paused. "The real ones clap before they judge." Bob Dylan watched every movement. He had spent years collecting stories from ordinary people. Tonight, they seemed to be walking through the front door, one after another. He couldn't stop thinking about something Elvis had said. "Songs belong to whoever needs them most." Bob quietly wrote the sentence into his notebook. He didn't know it yet, but decades later he would still remember those words. Frank turned back toward Walter. "You still remember Memphis in '49? Walter laughed. "I remember you missing every third chord. I missed every fourth. You missed every third." The room laughed. Frank pointed toward Elvis. "Who's your friend?" Walter smiled. "You really don't recognize him?" Frank studied Elvis for a moment. Then his eyes widened. "I'll be—" Elvis tipped his head politely. "Nice to meet you." Frank shook his head. "I spent 15 years telling people music didn't need kings." He smiled warmly. "And then the king walks into my favorite tavern." Elvis laughed. "I'm just another guitar player tonight." "No," Frank replied. "Tonight you're something rarer." "What's that?" "Someone who showed up." Those words lingered in the room. Someone who showed up. Not because cameras were rolling, not because newspapers would print the story, simply because another musician needed someone beside him. The bartender quietly leaned toward Bob Dylan. "You writing all this down?" Bob smiled. "I'm trying." "You won't capture it." Bob looked up. "Why not?" The bartender looked toward Elvis and Walter. "Because some nights aren't made of words. They're made of feelings." Meanwhile, the tallest cowboy had grown impatient. "This is turning into a church service." One of his friends laughed. "We came for music." Frank nodded. "So did we." The cowboy pointed toward Walter. "Then let him play." Walter looked uncertain. Frank noticed immediately. "You know what your problem is?" Walter sighed. "I've got several." "You keep looking at them." Frank pointed toward the cowboys. "You used to look at the music." Walter stared silently. Then Frank gently turned Walter's shoulders away from the hecklers. "There. Now all you can see is us." Elvis smiled. "That's better." Walter rested his fingers on the guitar once again. This time they barely shook. Not because the fear had disappeared, because he no longer faced it alone. Frank picked up an old harmony guitar from beside the stage. Elvis stood between them. 3 generations of musicians, 3 different journeys, 1 song. Walter softly picked the opening rhythm of Folsom Prison Blues. The familiar train-like beat rolled through the tavern. This time, he didn't rush. He let every note breathe. Frank quietly added rhythm beneath him. Simple, steady, supportive. Elvis still hadn't sung a single word. He watched Walter carefully, waiting, encouraging, never taking over. Walter began singing. "I hear the train a-comin'." His voice was fragile, older, weathered. But something extraordinary happened. Nobody heard weakness anymore. They heard experience. Every lyric sounded like it belonged to a man who had survived disappointment without allowing it to destroy kindness. The tavern grew perfectly still. Even glasses stopped clinking. Halfway through the verse, Walter stumbled over a chord. Instinctively, he stopped playing. Old habits, old fear. Before embarrassment could return, Elvis quietly sang the next line without missing a beat. Frank kept the rhythm moving. Walter looked up. Neither man had looked disappointed. Neither had tried to replace him. They had simply carried him until he found the next chord. Walter smiled, then rejoined the song, stronger than before. Bob Dylan felt goosebumps run down his arms. That wasn't performance. That was trust. He had seen countless musicians try to outshine one another. Tonight, he was witnessing the opposite. 3 men refusing to let one another fall. The chorus arrived. This time Elvis joined fully, not with the enormous stage voice that filled arenas. Instead, he sang softly, matching Walter's tone, following his timing, leaving space where Walter needed confidence. It was one of the gentlest performances Elvis had ever given, because it wasn't about being heard, it was about making sure someone else was. When the final chorus ended, silence filled the room. No one clapped immediately, not because they disliked it, because many were wiping tears from their eyes. The bartender quietly removed his glasses. A young waitress leaned against the wall, crying openly. Even one of the cowboys looked down at his boots. Then applause erupted, not loud, not wild. It was something deeper, the kind of applause people give when they realize they've witnessed something they cannot explain. Walter lowered his head. He hadn't received applause like that in decades. His eyes filled with tears. "I thought," he struggled to finish the sentence, "I thought everyone had forgotten me." Elvis gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," he smiled. "They only needed to remember." The tallest cowboy slowly stood. The room became tense again. He walked toward the stage. Walter stiffened. Frank narrowed his eyes. The cowboy stopped only a few feet away. Then, to everyone's surprise, he removed his hat. "I'm sorry." Nobody spoke. He swallowed hard. "My daddy," his voice faltered, "used to play guitar." He looked toward Walter. "I laughed because—" He paused. "Because hearing you reminded me that I haven't thought about him in years." Walter stared at the young man. The cowboy continued, "I don't know why I acted like that." Elvis quietly answered, "Sometimes people laugh at the things that hurt the most." The cowboy nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I reckon that's true." Walter stepped forward. Without saying a word, he placed his old guitar into the young man's hands. The cowboy looked startled. "I can't take this." Walter smiled. "I'm not giving it to you." The room watched in silence. "I'm asking you to hold it." The young man carefully wrapped his hands around the worn instrument. Walter nodded toward the strings. "Now tell me, when was the last time you played?" The cowboy looked down, unable to answer, and at that moment, everyone in the tavern realized the evening had never been about one forgotten musician. It had been about every person carrying a song they were too afraid to play. The old guitar rested in the young cowboy's hands as though it weighed far more than wood and steel. No one in the tavern spoke. The laughter that had echoed through the room less than an hour earlier had vanished completely. The cowboy stared at the faded finish, running his thumb over hundreds of tiny scratches left by decades of performances, rehearsals, and long nights on forgotten stages. Walter smiled gently. Every mark has a story. The young man swallowed. My father had one like this. Walter nodded. I know. The cowboy looked up, confused. You knew my father? Walter's eyes softened. I didn't know him well. He paused. But I knew his music. The room remained perfectly still. He played 2 towns over from me back in the 50s. Walter chuckled quietly. He wasn't the best guitarist. The cowboy couldn't help smiling. He knew that. But he was one of the kindest men I'd ever met. Walter looked at the young man's face. You've got his eyes. The cowboy's lips trembled. He died when I was 16. Walter slowly nodded. I'm sorry. The young man looked down. I sold his guitar after the funeral. His voice cracked. Needed the money. Silence. I've regretted it every single day. No one judged him. Not Elvis, not Bob Dylan, not Frank, not even the bartender. Because everyone inside that room understood something. Regret sounds the same no matter who carries it. Elvis quietly stepped closer. What's your name? The young man hesitated. Tom. Well, Tom? Elvis smiled warmly. Your father would probably care a whole lot less about the guitar. He gently tapped the old instrument. Than whether you became the kind of man he'd be proud to recognize. Tom looked away, unable to hide the tears gathering in his eyes. I don't think I have. Walter placed a weathered hand on Tom's shoulder. Then tonight's a good place to start. Frank folded his arms. You know, he grinned. I've spent 40 years watching musicians. Everyone looked toward him. The ones with perfect technique usually impress people. He pointed toward Walter. But the ones with broken hearts, he let the sentence hang in the air, they change people. Bob Dylan quietly closed his notebook. For nearly 2 hours he had written page after page. Now, he realized there was nothing left to write. Some moments deserved memory instead of ink. The bartender suddenly spoke from behind the counter. I think we're forgetting something. Several customers turned. What? He smiled. We've got Elvis Presley standing in the middle of a tiny tavern. A few people laughed softly, and nobody's actually asked him to sing. The room erupted into warm laughter. Even Elvis rubbed the back of his neck. I was hoping to avoid that. No chance, Frank replied. Not anymore. One woman near the back called out, Just one song. Another customer joined in. Please. Soon the entire tavern echoed the same request. One song. One song. One song. Elvis looked toward Walter. What do you think? Walter smiled. I think you've earned the right to say no. Elvis looked around the room again. Then he slowly shook his head. I can't. The customers sighed with disappointment. Elvis continued smiling. I can't sing alone after a night like this. He turned toward Walter. You started this. Then toward Frank. You carried it. Finally, he looked at Tom. And I think somebody else needs to finish it. Tom's eyes widened. Me? You. I haven't played in years. Walter laughed softly. Neither had I. The room chuckled. Tom stared at the guitar. His hands were shaking. Elvis leaned closer. Being nervous means it matters. Slowly. Very slowly. Tom wrapped the guitar strap over his shoulder. His fingers searched for the first chord. It wasn't perfect. Neither was the second. Someone in the audience smiled. Nobody laughed. Tom looked toward Walter. Walter simply nodded. Keep going. Frank quietly joined with soft rhythm. Walter added harmony. Then Elvis stepped to the microphone. Instead of taking the lead, he sang beneath Tom's uncertain voice, supporting him, protecting him, exactly as he had protected Walter earlier. The entire tavern realized what Elvis had been doing all night. He wasn't trying to become the center of every song. He was helping forgotten voices become heard again. When the final chord faded away, no one remained seated. Every person inside the tavern rose to their feet. The applause lasted nearly 2 full minutes. Walter cried openly. Frank removed his hat. Tom wiped tears from his face without embarrassment. Even the bartender had stopped pretending he wasn't emotional. As the applause finally settled, Elvis walked to the microphone one last time. He looked around the room, not as a superstar, simply as another musician. When I was a boy in Memphis, he began quietly, I learned something from gospel singers. He paused. They used to say that music isn't measured by how loud people clap. The room listened closely. It's measured by what kind of people they become after the song ends. He looked toward Tom. If tonight sends one son home wanting to remember his father, then toward Walter. One musician home believing he still has another song left, then toward the audience. Or one stranger home choosing kindness over cruelty. He smiled. Then every note we played was worth it. The tavern remained silent. No one wanted to interrupt. Bob Dylan finally stood. He walked toward Elvis. The two men shook hands. I've seen a lot of performers, Bob said quietly. But tonight, he smiled, I watched a man refuse to let music become a competition. Elvis shrugged modestly. It never was. Bob nodded. I think people forget that. They do. Bob looked around the room. I won't. Before leaving, Bob tore one page from his notebook. He folded it carefully and handed it to Walter. Walter unfolded it. Only one sentence had been written. The greatest musicians don't prove they're better than everyone else. They remind everyone else they still have music inside them. Walter read it twice, then folded the paper and slipped it into his shirt pocket. I'll keep this. Bob smiled. I hope you do. Outside, dawn was beginning to brighten the Nashville sky. The rain had disappeared. Broadway's sidewalks reflected the first rays of morning sunlight. Elvis stepped toward his waiting Cadillac. Before getting inside, he turned back one last time. Through the tavern window, he saw Walter laughing with Tom. Frank was tuning another guitar. Customers who had entered as strangers were now talking like old friends. No cameras had captured the evening. No newspaper reporter had been there. There would be no headlines the next morning, no television interview, no photographs. And somehow, that made the night even more beautiful. Elvis smiled to himself. Some of the greatest performances in a musician's life are never recorded. He climbed into the car. As it disappeared down Broadway, the small neon sign reading "The Broken String Tavern" flickered once before glowing steadily again. Years later, musicians across Nashville would tell the story of an unforgettable evening when the world's biggest star walked into a forgotten tavern. Not to prove he was the greatest singer in the room, but to remind everyone that music was never about pride. It was about lifting another voice when it began to fall silent. Whether every detail of the story was remembered perfectly no longer mattered. The lesson survived. And sometimes a lesson can outlive a legend.